On the morning of December 7th, 1941, the sky over Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, was torn apart by the roar of planes and the thunder of explosions. In less than 2 hours, a surprise attack by the Empire of Japan killed 2,403 Americans, shattered the U.S. Pacific Fleet, and threw the United States into the Second World War. That date has lived in infamy for decades, a shorthand for a shocking, unprovoked attack. But the story of why it happened is so much more complicated than a single morning of violence. The attack wasn't sudden at all. It was the final, desperate act in a story that had been unfolding for nearly a century. This is the story of a desperate gamble, fueled by a critical resource shortage and crippling U.S. sanctions that pushed an empire to the breaking point. The ambitious empire. To really understand the road to Pearl Harbor, we can't start in 1941. We have to go all the way back to 1853. That's when U.S. Navy Commodore Matthew Perry sailed his heavily armed black ships into Tokyo Bay, forcing an end to over 200 years of Japanese isolation. This was a massive shock to the Japanese. They saw what happened to their neighbor, China, which had been carved up and humiliated by Western powers, and they swore that would not be their fate. What came next was one of the most incredible national transformations in history, the Meiji Restoration. Japan went on a frantic campaign to modernize, to catch up with the West politically, economically, and especially militarily. The mantra was Fukoku Kaiohei, enrich the country, strengthen the military. They adopted Western technology and industry, determined to become a great power on their own terms. They looked at the empires of Great Britain, France, and the United States, and came to a simple conclusion. To be an equal, Japan needed an empire too. But Japan had one huge, inescapable weakness. It's a nation of islands, with almost none of the natural resources needed to run a modern industrial economy or a powerful military. It had some coal, but virtually no oil, iron, or rubber. To build the battleships, tanks, and planes it needed for an empire, Japan had to import almost everything. This dependency was the country's fatal flaw, and it would shape its foreign policy for the next 50 years. The first steps of its imperial ambition were close to home. Stunning victories in the First Sino-Japanese War and the Russo-Japanese War shocked the West. A non-Western nation had defeated a major European power. Japan gained control of Taiwan and Korea and got a foothold in Manchuria, a resource-rich region in northeastern China. These wins fueled a powerful sense of national destiny, but they also deepened the addiction to expansion. Every new territory needed more resources to control, and the military, which grew more powerful with each victory, always demanded more. This cycle put Japan on a collision course with the existing world powers, especially with the United States. The quagmire in China. By the 1930s, the Great Depression had the world in its grip. Global trade collapsed. For Japan, a country that lived and died by its exports and imported materials, the economic crisis was a catastrophe. At the same time, its military leaders, who were increasingly dominating the government, saw a simple solution: more conquest. They set their sights on Manchuria. It was rich in coal and iron, and strategically located the perfect first step toward resource independence. In 1931, Japanese army officers faked an attack on a Japanese-owned railway in what became known as the Mukden Incident. They used it as a pretext to invade and occupy the entire region. The world wasn't fooled. The League of Nations condemned the aggression, and Japan, in a gesture of defiance, just walked out of the organization. This was the point of no return. Japan was now an international outcast, committed to military expansion. But Manchuria wasn't enough. In 1937, a small skirmish between Japanese and Chinese troops at the Marco Polo Bridge exploded into a full-scale invasion of China. The Second Sino-Japanese War was supposed to be over in 3 months. That was a catastrophic miscalculation. Instead of a quick win, Japan found itself sinking into a vast, bloody quagmire. Chinese resistance was far tougher than expected. The war dragged on, year after agonizing year, burning through men, equipment, and most importantly, resources. The war in China became an insatiable furnace. To keep it going, Japan needed more oil for its ships and planes, more steel for its guns, more rubber for its trucks. And who was the main supplier of these vital materials? The United States, the very same country that was becoming its main rival in the Pacific. For a while, this strange relationship held. The U.S., while officially neutral and sympathetic to China, was still selling Japan the very materials it was using for its war. But as the sheer brutality of the war horrors, like the rape of Nanking, shocked the world, American opinion began to turn. The slow, steady squeeze was about to begin. The American response in the 1930s, America was deeply isolationist. Scarred by World War I, the public wanted nothing to do with conflicts in Asia or Europe. But President Franklin D. Roosevelt and his administration watched Japan's rampage through China with growing alarm. They saw it as a direct threat to American interests and stability in the Pacific. The American response wasn't a sudden hammer blow, but a gradual tightening of the economic screws. The goal was to stop Japan's aggression without starting a war. In 1939, Washington let a commercial treaty with Japan expire. Then, in 1940, it passed the Export Control Act, giving the president the power to block the sale of critical materials. At first, the restrictions were on things like aviation fuel and scrap metal. Each sanction was a signal, a warning to Tokyo, but the signals were either ignored or misinterpreted. Japan's military leaders saw these moves not as a response to their aggression, but as an American plot to block their destiny. The absolute turning point came in the summer of 1941. In July, Japanese forces moved into southern French Indochina, modern-day Vietnam. This was a critical strategic move. From bases there, Japan could threaten British Malaya and the oil-rich Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia. For Washington, that was the last straw. On July 26, 1941, Roosevelt issued an executive order freezing all Japanese assets in the United States. Britain and the Dutch followed suit. This wasn't just another sanction. This was economic warfare. It meant Japan could no longer buy anything from the U.S. a week later. On August 1st, it was made official with a full embargo on oil. The impact on Japan was immediate and devastating. The country lost access to almost 90% of its oil overnight. Its economy and military were suddenly on a death clock. The Imperial Japanese Navy had only enough oil reserves to operate for maybe a year and a half, much less, in a real war. America's position, delivered in tense negotiations, was simple. Japan had to withdraw from China and Indochina. Only then would the embargo be lifted. The final American offer, the whole note, delivered on November 26, 1941, repeated these demands with zero concessions. For the leaders in Tokyo, this wasn't a proposal. It was a humiliating ultimatum. To accept would mean abandoning the empire they had spent half a century building. It would mean admitting defeat in China after years of horrific sacrifice. For the military leaders, it was an unacceptable loss of face. They felt cornered. And as the proverb says, a cornered mouse will bite a cat. The time for talking was over. The choice was clear. Give up and wither away, or fight and hope for a miracle. The desperate gamble. The oil embargo kicked off a frantic final debate in Tokyo. The clock was ticking. They had two terrible options. Option one was to give in to America's demands, pull out of China, and watch the Japanese empire crumble. For any leader who suggested it, this was political suicide. Option two was war, a massive military operation to seize the resource-rich colonies of Southeast Asia, British Malaya and Singapore, the American-held Philippines, and the ultimate prize, the Dutch East Indies with their vast oil fields. It was the only way to break the American embargo. But there was one giant obstacle in the way. The U.S. Pacific Fleet anchored just 4,000 miles away at Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt had moved the fleet there from San Diego, completing the transfer in 1940 as a deterrent, a fleet in being, to make Japan think twice. But now, that deterrent looked like a dagger pointed right at the flank of their southern invasion plan. Japanese war planners were convinced that any move south would bring America into the war. They couldn't risk leaving the Pacific Fleet intact, where it could sail out and cut their new, vital supply lines. This is where Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of Japan's combined fleet, comes in. Ironically, Yamamoto didn't want a war with America. He had served as a naval attaché in Washington, D.C., and knew America's industrial power firsthand. He famously warned Japan's leaders that he could run wild for 6 months or a year, but after that, he had utterly no confidence in victory. But Yamamoto was a loyal officer. Once the decision for war was made, he believed Japan's only hope was to strike a devastating, preemptive blow. His plan was incredibly audacious. Use Japan's 6 frontline aircraft, carriers to sail in total secrecy across the Pacific, and launch a surprise attack to wipe out the U.S. fleet. The goal wasn't to conquer America. They knew that was impossible. The goal was to destroy the Pacific Fleet, buy Japan 6 months to a year of unopposed action, and shatter American morale. He gambled that a stunning defeat would force the U.S. to the negotiating table, allowing Japan to keep its new empire. Many in the Japanese Navy thought the plan was insane. The logistics were a nightmare. If the task force was discovered, it would be a catastrophe. If the American carriers, the primary targets, weren't in port, the attack would be a failure. But Yamamoto was relentless. He pushed, he argued, and he even threatened to resign. In the end, he got his way. On November 26, 1941, the very same day, the whole note was delivered in Washington. A Japanese task force slipped out of a remote bay and began its long, silent journey toward Hawaii. This chain of events shows how one decision can lead to another, and another, until war becomes almost inevitable. If this is the kind of history you find fascinating, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next video. And let us know in the comments what other historical why questions you want us to dig into. The attack on December 7th was a stunning tactical success. In just a few hours, Japanese planes sank or crippled 8 U.S. battleships, destroyed nearly 200 aircraft, and killed 2,403 Americans. In Japan, the news was met with celebration. It looked like Yamamoto's gamble had paid off, but it was a strategic catastrophe. By a sheer stroke of luck, the American aircraft carriers were out at sea and escaped unharmed. The attack also failed to destroy the base's crucial fuel depots and repair yards, which allowed the Navy to recover far faster than anyone imagined. But most importantly, Yamamoto and the leaders in Tokyo completely misread the American people. They gambled that a shocking blow would break America's will to fight. Instead, it forged it into steel. The attack on Pearl Harbor ended years of bitter debate about isolationism overnight, uniting the American public with a singular sense of resolve. The sleeping giant that Yamamoto had feared was now wide awake and filled with a terrible determination. The next day, the United States declared war on Japan. A few days later, Japan's ally, Nazi Germany, declared war on the U.S., pulling America fully into the global war. The conflict Japan hoped to win in a few decisive months became a brutal 4-year war of attrition against a nation whose industrial power dwarfed its own. The resources Japan sought by attacking Pearl Harbor were ultimately consumed in a losing war that ended in total defeat, nuclear devastation, and the end of its empire. So, why did Japan attack Pearl Harbor? It wasn't an act of madness. It was the final, desperate move of a nation trapped by its own ambitions. A nation with a modern military, but a pre-modern resource base. The war in China was bleeding it dry, and the American oil embargo gave it a choice. Let its empire die, or risk everything on a single roll of the dice. They chose to roll the dice, and in doing so, sealed their fate and changed the course of world history.